So it is going to be led by Joyce Petrella, managing partner of Calculus of Talent. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our moderator, and then we're going to jump right in and meet your panelists today with self-introductions. So Joyce is with Calculus of Talent, a global network of professional talent management practitioners. The network addresses the changing needs of today's diverse workforce. Her expertise lies in business and talent strategy development, leadership improvement, executive coaching, learning and development strategies, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and change management. So Joyce, you guys can go ahead and hop on the virtual stage with me, and I'll let Joyce drive this conversation forward with our fantastic speakers. We have Ron Adams with Northwestern Mutual, Dominica with Freddie Mac, and then Silke with Philip Morris International. So I'll let everyone self-introduce so you guys can meet everyone, and we'll get started. Oh, we can't hear you yet, Joyce.
Unmute. There
we go.
You
are.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Charlene, and welcome everyone for the first panel discussion of today's session. As Charlene mentioned, we have some great panelists today, and she's already introduced me, but so I will go on ahead and have you meet some of our great panelists. Ron, why don't you go ahead and get started? You're in my upper right little square there, so please go ahead and get started.
Good morning, Joyce. A pleasure to be here. I'm Ron Adams. I'm Vice President of Field Diversity and Inclusion at Northwestern Mutual, where I lead our strategy for our career distribution, from recruiting, development, inclusive culture, fostering that culture that we want and desire across our system across North America.
Great, wonderful, and thank you for joining us today. Dominica, I see you in the next quadrant, so please introduce yourselves and thank you.
Good morning. Are you all able to hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, fantastic. Just always have to check. So my name is Dominica Groom Williams, and I have the great pleasure of being the Vice President of Office of Inclusive Engagement, and that encompasses employee diversity, supplier diversity, community engagement, and all of our regulatory related efforts around those three areas. Excited to be a part of this panel and look forward to today's discussion.
Wonderful, and thank you. And I believe our third panelist will be joining us in progress. I don't see her on our screen yet. So let's go ahead and get started anyway. And when she does, we'll interrupt and go ahead and introduce Silke from Philip Morris. So let's go ahead and get started. You know, we started the title of this, Equity in the Eyes of the Beholder, because what we're observing is sometimes our definition of diversity has been somewhat narrow in focus, and we'd like to expand that in our dialogue today. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Let's make sure we understand what our definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion really means to us in 2021. Dominica, you want to go ahead and get started?
Absolutely. So there's a quote that I heard many, many years ago that sort of remains relevant. And I know we all have been on social media and we've seen these different memes as it relates to DEI, but diversity is sort of being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance, and then equity is being able to select the music, right? So I think that's a great way to put it that's relatable for everyone. There are different phases of this journey. So you can have the diverse representation, but does everybody feel included? And more beyond included, is everybody being treated equitably and sort of at the same level playing field? So that's sort of the way that I like to define it and make it relatable for everybody, and hopefully it resonates with people.
You know, that's great. I love that analogy. Those are wonderful. Thank you. Ron, I'm going to turn to you, and I see that Silke has joined us, so we'll end with her on this particular definition around equity. So Ron, go ahead. How do you see it at Northwest Mutual?
I love how Dom put it. That's another analogy that is often used by practitioners to keep it simple so people can wrap their minds around it. As you continue the conversation, I think what I see a challenge is when you start talking about equity, sometimes you'll see people with titles that says diversity and inclusion. Like in my title, you won't see equity in my title, but that doesn't mean that equity isn't a core function of the work. When you talk about inclusion, without equity, you're going to struggle with bringing in diverse talent, retaining diverse talent, right? And you're going to struggle with having an inclusive culture. So equity is always a component of your D&I strategies, whether or not you use the term equity or not. So then what is equity? Where the other confusion comes in is when we start talking about equity, people think equal, and they think equality versus equity. And why is that distinction important? It's important because when you start saying equity and then you say, hey, we need a multicultural leadership program, people say, well, why do you need that's not equal. We don't have this, you pick the name, program. Why would you need a multicultural leadership program? And so equity is not about it being the same. Equity is about giving people the tools and resources they need that is unique to them, and being unapologetic about it because it's in the best interest of the culture and of the organization to meet its goals and objectives.
Yeah, yeah, and instilling that within the culture as well. So for those of you who have not met Silke, I'd like to introduce her now. Silke, thank you for joining us today. Please share a little bit about your background, and then perhaps you can just segue directly into the question about how you define at Philip Morris the notion of diversity and equity and inclusion in your shop.
Thanks a lot, Joyce, and sorry for being late. Talking the terms of equity and equal, apparently I needed more support than the others to be able to join this technically. So that is my definition. I'm Chief Diversity Officer at Philip Morris, and we call our department Inclusion and Diversity. So similar to Ron, I have to say, the word equity doesn't show up. But inclusion and diversity is all about equity. And I think there's almost nothing to add. You gave wonderful definitions, Dom and Ron, before. But I think one of my favorite sentences, which you heard probably like 10, 15 years ago a lot, was that people said, look, I have no problem. I have no bias. I treat everybody equal. And this is wrong for two reasons, because everybody has a bias. And secondly, treating everybody equal will not get us to the results we want, because as we discussed, different people need different kind of support. And I hear this still, and I'm sure the two of you as well, a lot, that somebody says, but why do we need a specific program for women or for Asian talent? Because we have a leadership development program that captures everybody. No, different people need different support in order to have the equal opportunities. That's where equal is the right word. That's what we are looking for.
Yes, thank you, Silke. And as a matter of fact, I'd like to double click with you. Share a little bit about what's going on at Philip Morris and why diversity has a broader definition in your world because of your global nature and where you do business.
Yeah, I think diversity is so important for us, and it's diversity and inclusion. Never forget inclusion. Is super important. Is kind of a business imperative, because we are in a transformation. We are clearly transforming our business with our vision for a smoke-free future, and this requires a lot of innovation. And we see that inclusion and diversity is a fundamental need if you want to have a truly innovative company. And I think the challenges for us as a global company is that the needs are very different. Going from a European country to an Asian country is like, in today's world, we are all probably working from home. I guess the same is true for the US as for us in Europe currently. I think working from home is something which works very nicely in Europe, but we have countries in Asia where people actually like to go to the office because it's even more safe, and space has a different definition in Asian countries. So while we think flexible work and working from home is good for us, that is not true everywhere in the world. And that's where you need to be really careful and not make any assumption and take care of the different needs of people around the world.
Yeah, I think in multinational organizations, we find that is a huge challenge. And when we talk about the eyes of the beholder, we really have to be very in tune to what they are experiencing, what those diverse talent is experiencing, because we can't import our Western ideals as to what that might look like. That's very, 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 very true. Thank you, Silke. Dominica, back to you. We talk a lot about best practices. What can we leverage from some of the work that you're doing at Freddie Mac?
Well, I think it's important when we talk about best practices. I think everybody has to sort of level set expectations, right? So the best practice that I would share is sort of understanding where you are on the journey. So as all of my colleagues have talked about, everybody's at a different phase of their journey, and this means something different to everyone. So the best practice from my perspective is sort of identifying that, understanding where you're starting from. For instance, how we define DEI. Every organization may be defining it differently. What we've done, even though we have a long-standing commitment to DEI, we've sort of restarted that conversation as an outcome of the unfortunate incidents of George Floyd last year, just to ensure that we were all operating on the same playing field and everybody had that same level of understanding. So it's important to understand that. Once you understand where you are on the journey, then it's understanding what's most important to your enterprise. So while I could take best practices from Ron and from Philip Morris, at the end of the day, it's really understanding what's applicable to your environment and your culture and what's going to be most valuable in your journey and working through that. So the best practice, again, that I would share is sort of defining where you are, defining what that means to your organization, and then identifying the best next steps based off of your specific journey versus everybody else's.
Dom, how do you do that? How do you know where you are on the journey? I think, sometimes we can't really diagnose where we are. How have you done it in your organization?
Absolutely. So a variety of things, right? I mean, we all have data, right? We all have a workforce, so we have human capital data. Most of us are a part of big corporations that do employee engagement surveys, so we have information through those avenues as well. And then, more recently, we've just been engaging in transparent dialogue. So we've had the data, we have the qualitative output from these surveys, but what other information were we missing? So just having those candid conversations with our workforce to understand we're doing all these wonderful things, but what does it mean to you? Does it mean anything? And if it does, great, tell us more. And if it doesn't, tell us more as well so we can figure out how to chart our course. Also, obviously, with us being federally regulated, it's having those transparent conversations with our regulator around sort of their expectations, what we're working on, and working together. I love the viewpoint of our regulator in that they always articulate that we're all on the same journey together. So while they're obviously overseeing our operations, they have the same desire for outcomes that we do. So having that sort of partnership is important because we can work together to sort of achieve the overall outcomes for the organization.
Yeah. You've got a lot of cooks in your kitchen, don't you?
Absolutely. But it's beneficial because I honestly, from this viewpoint, the more cooks you have, the better the outcome and the better the meal that you can serve. And we're all about great food. So
there you go. And speaking of lots of cooks in the kitchen, tell me, Ron, I'm going to turn to you because you really do have a variety of different stakeholders in your practices. And can you talk a little bit about that and how maybe some of our listeners today can really learn from you?
I think Dom made a great point around being able to take best practices from different people, but it is all about where you are as an organization. What's unique to your organization? So at Northwestern Mutual, a financial firm, we have a large corporate footprint. We also have a distribution system of business owners. And so that's a different conversation. It's one thing to drive in a strategy around culture from your employees. It's a different conversation trying to drive a shared vision culture through 76 network offices who are actually business owners. And so co-creation is important, having the tough conversations and wrestling with what we mean. And so what we had to do was create a long-term strategy. We are a mutual company. We approach everything from a long-term perspective, naturally, as a business model. And so we wanted to lean on that strength. So we wanted to take a long-term approach. The benefit of taking a long-term approach is that you don't get shaken when the market turns, because you know it's going to turn back around and you've planned for the long term so you can ride that downturn. And so I think we took that approach as it relates to diversity and inclusion, and we developed a 15-year roadmap. And we bucketed that roadmap into 4 different portions. We had the commit to the mix phase, where we said, what does this mean? What does diversity inclusion mean to Northwestern Mutual? We pulled in all of the stakeholders. We had the hard conversations. We wrestled with it, as Brene Brown would tell you to do, right? And we didn't expect everyone to agree. And you had space not to agree. And so that we can have dialogue and try to listen and understand. So we went through that process. What that allowed us to do was to put the best plan forward to improve the mix. So now the next phase of that is to improve the mix. What we didn't want to do is go out, throw a bunch of money at marketing, advertising, recruiting, and then bring all these people into a culture that wasn't ready, who hadn't had those conversations, who hadn't prepared leaders to some extent, right? To deal with the nuances that diversity brings to an organization. And so that was the next phase of it. Now let's improve the mix. Then we want to optimize the mix, right? We want people to know that this is important to us. We want to be seen as a leader in this space. And then eventually we want to maximize the mix. We need this to be ingrained into the fiber of our organization, which is the point that I will end on. This has to be something that is integrated into the organization and into the strategy. If your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are rooted in a department or a person, it is not sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, and I remember you telling us a lot about the way to kind of get it out to those business owners, which is unique in your business model, not necessarily in financial services and insurance, but in some organizations that we have represented here in our audience. How do you get them engaged in what appears to be a corporate rollout? It sounds like you're really making it personal and integrating it in a lot of the work that you do. Do you have any practices you'd like to share about how that got very tactical?
One of the things we did was we integrated it into all the touch points. So we started with leadership. I believe that leadership is the key to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Everyone comes at this from a different angle. Me having so many years in the military, and understanding what leadership means and how important it is, I take a leadership bend to it. And so I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion has to be a leadership competency, which just like budgeting, like finances, is an expectation of a leader. You measure in any leadership discussion on talent, there are certain things that you evaluate them on. I believe that the ability to understand diversity, equity, and inclusion should be one of those areas in which you assess a leader or someone who you're thinking of putting into leadership in, which means you have to integrate that into your leadership development programming. And so that was how we got it to the system. We integrated it into a leadership development strategy, and we started with the most senior executive leaders, where we came together and we had those hard conversations. And we talked about it, and then we came to some level of agreement on what that would mean, on what expectations we would have of leaders.
Excellent. So you embedded it right into your core competency work. Fascinating. That's great. Silke, I'm going to turn to you again in a complex, global, multinational organization. What about best practices? What is your perspective on best practices and how you implement it there?
I think I have a combination of both Dom and Ron probably as an answer. And I think I completely agree with Dom that everybody has to come from, from your own where you are, and you need to do the analysis first. And my background is marketing and market research. So I start with an analysis of my consumer, in this case, our employees, and clearly understand where the problems are, because best practices is super difficult, and what might be best practice for us might not work for others. But at the same time, I think what we have done, and that's maybe similar to what you've done, Ron, is like we have accountability for diversity, female representation for all our leaders. And what we've done this year is we haven't put out the global target. We have broken it down by function, by region, so that clearly every people leader has their own target, and back this with data so that it's stretched but achievable. and was discussed with them upfront. And you clearly see it's now an important part of their business objectives. And that also changes the discussion. So it's very often easier to get support as well, or they ask us for support. But ultimately, again, as Ron said, the I&D, inclusion and diversity, has to be the responsibility of everybody. Is like, our department, myself, is like, we can facilitate discussions, but it happens, with everybody. And I think what I'm looking for is, because currently we are measuring diversity or female representation, but what I think is even more important going forward, because ultimately what we want is inclusion. So I think I'm really looking for a way to measure how inclusive your culture is. And again, that might be different for different companies how to measure this. But we have embarked on a research project together with IMD Business School, where we want to define what the current status of inclusion is and how to measure it. Because ultimately, I want to measure leaders against how inclusive the culture is they create in their area of responsibility, because that will help all different groups of minority, and will also be able to touch upon the very complex topic of intersectionality.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. And to do it on a global scale too, that's pretty aspirational. I mean, I really give you a lot of credit. Dom, any reactions to this notion of being able to measure it and use the intersectionality and the eyes of the beholder? Tell me how you tackle
Absolutely.
it.
Intersectionality is important. So I echo Ron and Silke's sentiments. At the end of the day, you cannot just have these standalone teams. We are all passionate about this subject matter, but without accountability across the full organization, nothing happens. So we believe sort of in the democratization of I&D, as we like to call it. So while we have a dedicated team that focuses on diversity and inclusion, we are the influencers, not the decision makers. So we hold the decision makers accountable. So similar to everyone else, we have sort of corporate metrics that we focus on, our 3 pillars of diversity, as we like to call them. And then we break it down even further. In every now division, we have 11 business divisions across our company. Every division has to develop a dedicated inclusion and diversity action plan annually. Yeah. And this is a plan where they sort of identify how they're going to support those corporate goals, as well as our overarching I&D strategy, and how they're intersecting that into their day-to-day business operations. So we've really been focused on creating a committed effort where we as the practitioners can integrate ourselves into the business to learn more about business priorities. And then in turn, we can offer value in the offerings that we have programmatically on the I&D side to create outcomes. But at the end of the day, we're all focused on those same measurements and those same outcomes. So whether it's hiring, opportunities, whether it's leadership development, engagement, we're looking at all of those elements to make sure that we continue to integrate this into the business, and we see it sort of resonating across each one of the respective areas across the company.
Yeah, I see in our chat, there's a question about how being unapologetic about it, right? And to do this Absolutely. Because you're there to support. Any thoughts and comments about that?
Unapologetic is great. And I think also being unapologetic but being open, right? So we're unapologetically passionate and just, going right forward. But also, too, we have to understand that everybody is at different phases of this journey. And for many people, it's uncomfortable. We have sort of overused the term diversity for quite some time. And because of that, especially with the sensitivities of what's happening across the world, people automatically sort of interpret that as discrimination and back away because they don't want to say the wrong things. They don't want to do the wrong things. But a part of this conversation, and this is sort of how we positioned our leaders last year to have some of these tough conversations, is you're not going to always say the right thing, and that's okay. But it's empathy, right? And it's sort of having that compassionate heart that allows you to be a part of the conversation. But on the reverse side, for those who are of the diverse affinities, who are sort of trying to relay something that's important to them, they have to understand that people are coming to the table with good intention. So it goes, so everybody can be unapologetic, but at the end of the day, it's sort of bringing everybody together to drive it forward. I like to use the term that you cannot drive inclusion through seclusion. So if you really want to drive impact in this space, you really have to have everybody at the table to be a part of the discussion, as uncomfortable as it may be, to really render the outcomes that you're looking for.
Yeah, there's a follow-up question from Kentucky in response to some of what you're saying, Dom, and that's this idea. Do you schedule these focus groups, forums? How do you kind of get at conducting those candid conversations?
Absolutely. So we have business resource groups, like most companies, are affinity network groups. So a lot of the conversations organically evolve within those groups. Sure. Last year, though, when we talk about sort of areas of opportunity, one thing we recognize is that we had an opportunity to be more transparent about what we were doing and sort of what we were lacking in, and ultimately what we wanted to aspire to be. And so through that, we created more formal avenues for the forums where we would actually host different discussions, smaller, more intimate discussions, as well as more broad, open to the company discussions, to really have people share their perspectives and sentiments. I know most of our companies, we all have a tendency to be very scripted, right? So even preparing for this discussion, I had conversations with my communications team. What can I say? What shouldn't I say? And I'm the practitioner in this space, but they always give me great guidance, right? So that I don't misrepresent anything. However, sometimes you just need to have, let your guard down and say what's on your mind and talk about being unapologetic. We have a great example of some of our leaders in our company last year as a sort of an outcome of George Floyd, talking about being, a Black male in America. And while they may be an executive within our company, out in the world, they're just a Black male. Same with the recent impacts on the Asian community, where they may be an executive within our company, but in the world, they're just an Asian individual. So it's really creating that transparency and sort of making it human for people. And that dialogue and those forums have really allowed us to really elevate our focus and elevate our attention to where it matters.
Where it matters, yeah. Ron, I'm going to turn to you. Believe it or not, this all started with the notion of metrics and measures. Because you have such a diverse constituencies in your organization, both the business owners as well as the corporate entities, tell us a little bit about how you measure and whether you found any gaps that you wanted to work on because of the measures and metrics that you pursued.
Well, one of the things I was very interested in, Silke was discussing earlier around measuring inclusion. Mm-hmm. And so I think Dom had mentioned the engagement surveys that we do. So what we did last year was, in the engagement surveys a couple of years ago, we were able to look at the questions, identify questions. And in that engagement survey, we identified there were around 18 questions that we thought spoke to if we are inclusive or not. And what we did was we pulled those 18 questions out and then ran an index. Mm-hmm. So we created an inclusive index as a part of that engagement survey. And then we were able to identify what were the gaps. We were like, okay, when we look at this inclusion index, we have a lower score for our Black and African-American population than we do for our white male or Asian male population. What is that? Then we are able to break it down by firm. And so now we can get really targeted in the support that we're able to provide to the network offices, so that we then can have something to measure. Because the more tangible you can make it to the client, as Silke would say, like, who is the client there, the more they will engage in the work. That's just a fact that we have to accept. When you're talking theoretical and you're talking about diversity and inclusion and you can't make it real for people, it gets really hard to make this something that people want to focus on, especially really busy leaders who are trying to drive impact across so many different aspects of their business.
Yeah, yeah. As a matter of fact, we have a question from the audience about this notion of tying it also to your leadership competencies and maybe tying in some of your idea around tracking metrics and accountability. Any thoughts on that, Ron?
Yes. So one of the other things that we created was we created a tool. So what would good look like from a diversity and inclusion perspective? And we created a tool where we have both quantifiable and quantitative data that we can pull, and we create it based on leadership, representation, activity, market. And so some of the data is fixed, right? Do you have representation or not? Some of the data is more subjective, right? Are you leaning into this? Do you have the competency to do it? And we created a score. And so now I can go and pull a score for a network office, right? And say, okay, ideal is 80%. You're at 60%. The system average is 70%. Here's how you can move this. And so that's been one way, one tool that we've created that I think is game changer for us, because not only is it something that we can measure, but more importantly, from my perspective, it's now a coaching tool. Because now I can come to you and you, instead of you telling me all these great things you're thinking and doing, I can show you the results from them, and we can have a real conversation about some things we may need to change or add and things of that nature. And then the last thing I would say in terms of making this all real is we talked about BRGs and ERGs. Those are important. I also think that you should look at having councils, diversity and inclusion councils. The ERGs and BRGs are segment focused. Your council can be function focused. And so they both work together. And the power of having a council at a department or function level, or in my case, a network office level, it creates this, this funnel for information to travel both ways. I can push out content information. They can send me content and information in a systematic way to inform all of our strategies.
Gotcha. Fascinating. The way you've embedded it into almost every of your talent processes is pretty remarkable. I applaud you. I'm curious about that index, and I'm sure some folks may ping you somewhere along the line to hear more about that. But I do turn this question to you, Silke. When you look at the global nature of your firm, any reactions to the dialogue we've been having around metrics and measuring success as you go forward, particularly in decentralizing a lot of the decision-making that you have to do?
Yeah, look, measuring in a global context is always a bit more difficult. So we have the same employee engagement surveys as everybody else, but also different cultures have different ways of answering. So Asians, our Japanese colleagues are much more negative than our colleagues in Indonesia. So even within, a continent, you have big differences. And we also tried an inclusion index. So I'm also interested, Ron, of course, to hear what you've done. But the one we tried worked super well in Switzerland, but it didn't work in the Philippines. In the Philippines, everybody was the same. So that's why actually we said we need something which is validated. Because again, also to Ron's point, I think, having not only being able to compare within the company and say your team is like this and the average of the company is like this is a good way to guide people leaders. But I think even more important sometimes, at least in our company, is an external benchmark. If I can tell them, 100 companies out there have done the same, and their average is like this. So this is usually where the competitive aspect comes in. And people are really, I think they really understand the need for dialing up or dialing down certain elements. And I agree, the dialogue internally is super important. And we also have ERGs. We have global webcasts where, really you have 10,000 people being live on. And we have now introduced office hours for inclusion and diversity. So with smaller group of people to have this kind of discussion, because it's necessary to have uncomfortable discussions. Otherwise, we're not going to make progress. And I'm always saying, I don't do my job properly if not some people feel uncomfortable. That's the nature of the chief diversity officer, that some people clearly have to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, maybe we need an uncomfortable metric going forward. Absolutely. But it's fascinating as I hear you say, for example, that when in different countries, you're going to experience different metrics to a core standard. So how do you account for that? How do you accommodate that and weave it into your strategies on a local level?
Look, given that I have a research background, there are ways you can calibrate this. So it's it's not impossible. So you account for the average, the difference in the average, and that's fine. That works, even though they answer differently. But you also have to take into account that, you know, some cultures are more straightforward, you know, like me being German and my Russian colleagues as well, you know, we are usually very straightforward, and some other cultures are super polite, and also when talking to them, you know, they would never directly. So you always have to interpret. So you always need numbers and talking to people at the same time. That is super important. And then you might need very different. So for us, for example, we have a lot of business in Asia. And we know that we have not the right representation of Asians in our leadership. And that is partially because of the culture, because they are less aggressive, generalizing. And I think that's why we want to have a specific leadership program for our Asian employees in order to make sure that we can balance this representation of Asians in our leadership. So you have, again, to have different support programs, coming back to equity, for different groups of people.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Thank you. We have a variety of questions from the audience today, looking at this notion of councils or ERGs. And Dom, I believe you brought that up in your answer to one of the prior questions. As we start to wrap up this panel conversation, perhaps we could end on that note. Any advice or thoughts on ERGs or diversity councils? And we'll go around the panel to get our final thoughts on this. There is a white paper out on the Calculus of Talent booth if you'd like to download something on diversity councils, by the way, for those of you who are listening in. So please, Dom, take it away.
So echoing everyone's sentiments, I think a lot of great content today. You know, obviously it's the intersectionality, right? So with us, we actually went from ERGs to BRGs intentionally. So employee resource groups versus business resource groups. So we've sustained the great elements of the employee resource group side and that connectivity, but now we're leveraging this group of talent to drive outcomes in the organization, right? So we're directly tying it to our business, to the point that Ron made earlier, especially in the financial services industry. If you don't speak to people in numbers, people don't care. So you've got to figure out how to communicate in a quote unquote language that people understand. So we have now centered our BRGs around that intersectionality and driving those business outcomes. We have diversity councils as well, and it's valuable because, again, we are sort of the practitioners and the influencers, but these individuals sit within the lines of business. So they're the ones who are going to bring that great information to you. They can be able to sort of take your strategies and your sentiments around DEI and make it relevant and applicable to their respective areas and be accountable for that execution. So it's imperative. It's obviously something that you need to do in partnership with your leadership, because all of this isn't, if all of this isn't supported by leadership, you can have all of these great employees sort of supporting and activating against great work. But if leadership isn't setting the tone and really leading by the example and allowing this to happen within the organization, then it's a moot point.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Ron, your thoughts on that?
I agree with everything Dom said. I think she hit all the key points. The one thing I would leave with in terms of doing this work is that we have to make sure that we create an environment where everyone feel that their voice is heard. Diversity doesn't mean that because I'm the Black guy, I made the room diverse. Like, diversity is because we are not the same. And your white guys or whatever your dominant group is where you are, that needs to be clear in the communication to get this to work to be sustainable.
Yeah, valuable point. Silke, bring it on home. What kinds of advice might you have, particularly in this line of conversation?
I think we are relatively new. I learned over the last year that employee resource groups or business resource groups is something which is very well established in the US, not necessarily in Europe, and we are relatively new too. So we actually have our employee resource groups are still relatively young. So I'm probably not the best one to give advice on this one. Happy to download also whatever information is available on building councils. What we have built is what we call a soundboard. So we have asked employees in the company as volunteers to help us shape our strategy, not leaders, but people from across the organization, because with so many different nationalities, we as a small team can't represent everybody. And I think therefore we said it's important that we get input from all different groups within the company, and hopefully we touch on intersectionality there as well.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I think what we've learned today is just the notion that intersectionality and the whole idea of the eyes of the beholder is really something we, in the next generation, if you will, of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to really think about that third dimension that seems to be emerging in our workforce. So with that, thank you, panelists, for your time today. Fabulous insights, and I hope our audience has a lot to take home today. I'm going to hand it back to Charlene to tell us about next steps in the agenda. Charlene, take it away.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Silke. Thank you, Dom. I got a lot of notes myself, and we also still have more questions that are pouring in. So I will get that to you guys via email right after we conclude with this panel, so you guys can take a look. If you would like to log back into the virtual platform, you can join in the conversation as well. But I think you guys covered so much in so little time. So thank you again. And with that, I want to wish you guys the best. I'm going to make a few announcements before we head on to our next session. Wave you guys goodbye, and then I'll pull up my notes here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.